So I am the coordinator for a unit here at UAF in the International Arctic Research Center called the Alaska Fire Science Consortium. We're funded by the Joint Fire Science Program, which is a very small federal funding program focused on getting best available science to support fire management decisions. So we're mandated to work directly with the interagency fire management community here in Alaska to help them get the best available science to support their needs. And that is a pretty wide mandate. We're really lucky to have two partially retired managers who work with us and really help us keep science grounded. One of those is Robert Zeal, who actually still has an operational role as a fire analyst and was very active in leading the fire behavior modeling and analysis work this season in Alaska. So he actually prepared this slide, this little PDF. But it looks like he's out of cell coverage. He was supposed to give this talk. And then we also have Randy Jant, is a retired fire ecologist with the BLM, and she works with us on a seasonal basis to help us do our fire ecology work. So we're really focused on getting the science applied in a management context. So 2019 this first graph was prepared by Rick Toman of the Alaska Center for Climate Assessment and Policy, also here at UAF. And this is cumulative acreage burned over time with most of the most recent notable seasons there, and it kind of gives you a little profile of how a season, where the peak of the season is and how it progresses. So 2019 is the red line. 2004, which is our record season, is the green one. 2015, which is our most recent sort of notable, the season that sent everybody into kind of a little bit of a crash, is the black one. That's the one that where we had massive lightning busts right around solstice that ignited about 300 fires essentially simultaneously. So 2019 is a busy season. It's well above normal. There's so much variability in the record of acres burned in Alaska that it's really hard to say what is normal. Mean doesn't really cover it. Mean is probably about 650,000 acres, but we have started to say that normal, the cutoff for normal is actually more like 1 million acres in terms of sort of managers' ability to deal with it. So this is well above normal, but it's not record at all. And then there were periods where it was quite busy. We had 3 incidents that were significant in terms of being close to communities. And so that required quite a bit of management activity, and we needed to bring in a fair amount of help from the lower 48. So can you scroll down a little bit? Does anybody have any questions about that? About that graph? Actually, and there's a graph on the backup, or is it just my there we go. That's the one I was, yeah. So this is just human versus lightning ignitions, and a little bit about sort of the way managers think about the season. So there's a wind-driven season early in the year before fuels green up. It's sort of basically May, and that's mostly human ignitions, classic example of debris burning or people out on, campfire kind of thing. And then we move into what's called the duff-driven season. That's the fuels that really drive our fire season here is that moss duff underneath black spruce stands. And so it's how severe the season is really depends on the moisture conditions in that duff. So always interested to hear about SAR data because we're really interested in looking at soil moisture there. so that at the point where the fuels green up in early June is also when we start to have lightning emissions pick up. So you can see that the red line starts to pick up, and they peak in June and July, and then we move into what's called the drought-driven part of the season. So that's where it depends on whether or not we get the wetting rains that we are currently experiencing. But this graph also makes the point that that we, even though there are quite a few human ignitions, they're also, because they're human ignitions, they're near where humans are, so the fires are suppressed quickly. So most of the acreage burned is started from lightning. Anybody have any questions about this? Okay, scroll on down. And then this is a depiction of how managers look at fire danger. So they use, fire managers in Alaska and Canada both use something called the CFFDRS, the Canadian Forest Fire Danger Rating System. And that's a weather-based index system that essentially tries to estimate fuel moisture in those duff fuels, which is what drives our fire season. And this is the fine fuel moisture code, which is essentially the surface fire danger. And in the materials I send you, I'll also send you a link to the website where all of this information is accumulated and used by the managers. So there's actually a database going back to 1994 that has daily depictions of these indices across the state. But this is basically the peak day of 2019. This is July 9th, and shows you significant potential for new starts and initial growth all across the state. And then are there questions about this? Okay, and then I'll pull up this last one. This is also created by Rick Toman of ACAP, sorry. And this is just, he's been doing a little estimate of where are we going to end up in terms of acres burned based on where we are. So at this point in the season, we can be pretty confident that we've seen the end, and that we're likely to end a little above 2.5 million acres. But there's still the chance, if this rain stops, there's still some significant drought on the ground, especially in the upper Yukon. So it takes quite a bit of rain to get these fires out. And I think that's it from me. Anybody have any questions about any of that? All right. Well, if not, I need to jump off here and go to this other call. But thanks for listening. And I'll send you some stuff. And I have a minute. Great. Okay. Yep. All right.
Thanks, Alison.
Thanks, Alison.
Thank you, Meredith. Have a good rest of your meeting.
Okay. So Mike, if you want to introduce Dave, then we can do that. And Dave, if you want to share your screen, I think we're ready.
Okay. Yeah, so it's my pleasure to introduce David Lutz. He's an ecosystem scientist and with a background in forest ecology, ecosystem modeling, remote sensing, and ecological economics. And he's currently leading a NASA Above project that we recently funded, focused on using remote sensing and computational forest modeling to simulate ecosystem changes in ecosystem services in both Alaska and Canada. And he also leads several other projects that include monitoring freshwater lakes in New England using remote sensing, and then also designing automated wireless soil moisture monitoring networks for the U.S. Forest Service in New Hampshire. He's currently a research assistant professor in the environmental studies program at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire. So with that, I will turn it over to Dave and let him give his presentation on his recently funded Above Phase 2 project.
Great. How does that screen look? Does that look okay? Can you guys see? Let's see here.
Yep.
Okay, Meredith?
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay, great. Great, thanks. Thanks for inviting me to talk a little bit about the project. Mike has seen some of these slides at the above meeting in May with a little, I edited them a little bit, but I'll talk to you a little bit about the project that just is kind of starting to get going. That involves this cool fusion of remote sensing and then ecosystem modeling and then some economics modeling as well. You know, so I'm sure many of you on the call, you know, being a terrestrial ecosystems team, is aware of what's going on in boreal forests and their characteristics and challenges. But I like to think about these forests a lot. They cover a really wide area, you know, all across, you know, North America, Canada, all the way through Alaska, Russia, Siberia, and Northern Europe. And so they have an outsized impact on climate, both through the carbon they store and their land surface interactions. And they provide a wide range of services, right? Locally and globally to society. They really, as many of you know who've been up there and work in these systems, the season is very, you know, strong seasonal variability, right? So it can be quite dry, but it's also really, really cold, especially in the interior. So many of these tree species are really unique, and many of these stands are very low diversity, and that kind of presents a little bit of a challenge when we think about dealing with climate change. Another thing about these forests is that how they're managed varies so considerably. They stretch across many different countries, provinces, different types of governance structures, private, public, and because of that, if we're thinking about boreal forests and over time, the management variability presents us kind of a funky challenge with how we think about adaptation strategies, right? If we have many different types of managers who are doing different types of treatments, it's really important for us to think about each type of management and how they're disturbing forests, especially when many of these forests, like in the picture there, Tanana, the Valley State Forest is managed for a variety of interests, like tourism purposes, local use, and timber. The good thing is that these forests, boreal forests in particular, are really good ecosystems when we think about ecosystem modeling. And I'll highlight a couple things about them. You know, the main thing when we think about it in a modeling framework is that the lower species diversity means there's fewer species-specific parameters, right? I'm highlighting here in this photo kind of, you know, a dual species stand. And many of you who have been up there have seen, you know, a handful of species dominate an entire landscape. That figure on the right there is from a newly published paper from phase 1 investigation through Above. Adriana Foster, who was also working with our project and worked at University of Virginia with me, and that's showing you a list of species, the different species in her model. You know, so there's 7 or 8 of them, which is really nice in contrast to many other forest ecosystems that have 20, or in the tropics when you have hundreds. It's really challenging to get that much information. So when we're dealing with low species stands, it really is helpful that we're able to kind of have fewer, because it provides us a little bit better ability to categorize that information, putting it into a modeling framework, right? Another nice thing about boreal forests, and when we're thinking about, you know, predicting challenges, is that they've also been the focus of you know, decades of remote sensing community, stretching back to the early 90s, right? So some of these images here are from the Boreal campaign, which was in the early mid 90s in parts of Canada and Alaska. I'm showing you some old helicopters that were flying. Those are 1993. Some of the papers are from 1994. And that focus on boreal forest systems has continued now too through the above focus that Mike is helping to lead. And you also heard about other hyperspectral flights happening there too. So that's real nice that we have a lot of background in the modeling and remote sensing side of these forests in particular. It gives us a little bit more confidence in what we're looking at and how we're modeling them. Now, the interesting thing about the above project is the focus on understanding changes to the Arctic, resilience, and ecosystem services, and a lot of the work traditionally in terrestrial ecology and modeling, especially over these wide areas, are kind of these wide expanses of forests, but the management element has been a little bit less of a focus. A lot of it has been on changes in carbon stocks or changes in species movements. There has been a lot of work. Here's another figure from Adriana's paper showing some of the outcomes of a phase 1 project, mapping forest ecosystems all throughout the Alaska, the central Alaska, Fairbanks, Delta Junction area. But one thing, so we can do that pretty well. But it's really important that if we really are focused on ecosystem service, we have to fold in management. It's very important because that is taking the product and thinking about it in an applied sense, and thinking about how these forests are actually going to be utilized. We can add natural disturbances, but we really, and many of these forests are managed for timber and harvest. So we really need to have that as a component of our modeling framework. The project I'm leading kind of decided to look at a few specific areas. And one place that we really wanted to focus on were public lands, publicly managed lands. And generally, those are good areas to focus on because they tend to have mandated frameworks or management plans in place that have feedback from citizens and the public, right? If they're properties that are owned by the public, then there often will be committees or different group meetings like you're seeing in those photos of people coming in and chiming in. The Forest Service does this for national forests in the United States. There's one just up the road from me here, White Mountain National Forest, and they will have, if they're planning an action, they'll have a big meeting and you'll have representatives from many different interest groups coming and going on record. So this is really great from a modeling perspective because it gives us some sort of a trajectory to think about management, right? If you've just kind of got a private firm or nothing, it can be very random. But if you know you have some guidance as to how these trajectories are going to go, that's a little helpful because otherwise our modeling output can be very chaotic. We're not sure which direction we're going to go, and if you're talking about timber harvest, which place you're cutting really impacts what your outcomes are going to be. So I'll talk a little bit about the main objectives of the project, and the first one is to talk about using a forest gap model to simulate forest patterns and processes under some climate disturbance scenarios. And some of this work is a bridge to the first phase of the above campaign. We're using something called an individual-based gap model. So what one of these things does is it models individual tree stems, generally over relatively small areas, but it includes light dynamics and shading and internal competition within a stand. There are many different types of forest models. They range from landscapes that do cohorts to dynamic global vegetation models that span the whole world, like CLM, and those do plant functional types. But if we're focused on ecosystem services, and I'll talk a little bit about this in the next slide, it's nice to have those individual stems, because those individual stems are really what we interact with from a management perspective and an ecosystem service perspective. We're getting actual tree trunks that are valued by foresters, and they make decisions based on that unit. So this type of model is very helpful for thinking about understanding impacts to human societies. The model has been validated for this area. We have these two public sites, Tanana Valley outside of Fairbanks, and then Prince Albert National Park is within a Prince Albert Forest Management Area, and that's in Saskatchewan. And there's management plans of these areas that exist that we've talked to groups that manage these. We have letters of support for them. So as we were planning, we got in touch with these agencies and people that are involved in these spots, so that we knew that we could have a good reference for what we were going to model in terms of management actions. The other kind of part of this that's important is utilizing new remote sensing methods to constrain the model. So a lot of the earlier versions of this model were really just kind of forest inventory data, where you would simulate a forest ecosystem and you spin it up and then compare it to FIA sites through the Forest Service or other long-term inventory sites. And something that we really wanted to do and has been talked about for a while now in the modeling community is to use really high resolution remote sensing data to guide model trajectories. One way you can do that, and there's a couple figures here. One is through solar-induced fluorescence, which tells you a little bit about the productivity and photosynthetic capacity of a forest. That's important because if we're simulating a forest or a tree stand and we have these curves of growth and how it's accumulating biomass, but it's a hot year or a dry year or there's a disturbance, we can get information from these airborne flyovers and adjust our curves accordingly so that we're actually modeling what is happening rather than our idealized curves. So this is a part that we're going to fold in to model parameters. Another piece of that is on the right is LiDAR, which many of you know about, I'm sure, and Mike talked a little bit about the above this year's acquisitions and Elvis, and that's nice because many of these models originally are called spun up, and so when you're doing forest modeling, you start from bare ground, you spin them up over 300 years, you have them come to equilibrium, and then you move them forward. I'm going to jump back. This figure here from Adriana's paper was spun up for 300 years and then modeled into the future. But if we're actually thinking about real life situations with managers, we need to start from what's there now. We need to initialize those conditions based on inventory information. And LiDAR can help us do that because we can understand what the canopy looks like and with hyperspectral figure out what species are there and then construct site initialization files that look just like what's there now, so we can move from now onward rather than kind of a idealized state. So that's a big part of the project. The model, as we're adjusting them, the second objective is to think about these trade-offs between different ecosystem processes and services. So I was saying how it's nice that we have these individual-based models because we can think about things like timber values because we know stems and stem diameter and stem height, and we have stumpage prices for those. We can think about how much carbon is stored in the stems and boles of trees. We can think about shading and light, and we can think about other sorts of climate services, such as rate of forcing from albedo, and that's something that the Crystal's group has thought about a lot, and the products that we think about and utilize are really influenced by her work. So this part of it is being able to go to groups of stakeholders at both these sites, right, and talk to them and have participatory workshops where they say, you know what, climate's changing. What do we want our forested areas, our state forests or provincial areas to provide for us? And come to consensus to give us some alternative scenarios for management. Now they may vary a little bit with what's in place legally, but we think it's going to be really interesting to see what they say with more extreme adaptation measures, cutting down things that we don't think may do very well in a warm climate in 2050. This is stuff that's the Forest Service is doing all throughout the country as well. And using our kind of our advanced modeling to provide, and here you can see, here's a model, and then walking through with stakeholders and having them make decisions about kind of what trajectories of management there are, taking that information and putting back in these models, and then presenting the different scenarios back to the groups a year later in another workshop and saying, well, here's what our model produced, and what does that mean to you? Would you refine your management choices, right? Does this, maybe you want to think about another management, or maybe things look great, or we don't know what the results are going to be, but what's important is that people on the ground and stakeholders can think about a range of options, and especially because it's very, very challenging for stakeholder groups to predict how things may change, and it's helpful to have this kind of information because there's a lot of chaos in the modeling from fire or insect, and we can kind of construct these scenarios to at least get them thinking about this and maybe what some outcomes may be, and that's a major objective of the program. So there's these couple of frameworks. The first set of meetings with these stakeholders will be, or plan to be, sometime this late spring in Fairbanks, and then in the Prince Albert area, spring, early summer. But the goal here is this is a framework for connecting technological advancements and observation of ecosystems into computational ecosystem modeling, and then working with stakeholders and managers and citizens to think about what different options are and outcomes are for decisions they make in the context of how they interact with forests. So it is forest focused and it's boreal focused, but I think this framework can be utilized in a lot of places. And we have these two sites, but something I thought we talk about with the group would just be that we have these different ecosystem services that we can model pretty well, but surely there are other collaborators in the IARPC terrestrial group that know a lot about other ecosystem services or may have expertise in some of these case studies. And we'd like to expand the offering to include as many, because the more services you include, the more trade-offs decision makers need to think about it. In reality, they're balancing every single service really that reaches the public. In our models, we have 4 or 5, and we found in our modeling work that if you add one, decisions change a lot, right? Anyway, we want to make sure that there's other locations. We want to think about how products can be used by stakeholders too. So if there's people in IARPC who are stakeholder focused, what formats are the most helpful? If they're maps, if they're lists, if they're maps, what spatial scale and resolution are helpful? That's stuff that we don't know right now, and hoping through the workshops that we'll come to a little bit better understanding of that, so that we're producing things that people actually use rather than just data in general. So that's I think, I don't know if that was about 15 minutes. Hopefully I didn't go too long over. But I think IARPC is really cool. I mean, this is the team that's working on this, I'd be happy to talk to anybody who's interested or think about collaborative efforts or questions or spin-offs of this and where to go. So I'll stop. I'll stop sharing my screen. So if anybody has questions, happy to take them.
Thanks, Dave. I got a quick question. So you mentioned, maybe I missed it, but you mentioned doing stakeholder workshops in Prince Albert. Are you doing the same thing in Fairbanks area or Alaska?
Yeah, there's maybe I should. Oh no, there is one. I talked to the Citizens Advisory Committee to TVSF way back when, and also confirmed that there'll be, I think actually April 15th, I'll be flying up there, and they have a advisory committee that's made up of 20 plus stakeholders, including Alaska, the state of Alaska's forestry department, and they're going to, people who make up this advisory committee on how the state manages represent a diversity of stakeholder types, from timber operators to recreational users, etc. And so the idea is to get everybody all together. We have that. I had a call with them. I want to say early May, just to introduce myself, introduce the project, and get them together. And actually, when you mentioned the May 10th workshop, that it should be in the Fairbanks area, so that we even go up there and do that, and then come back and talk to them even more. But the more people we can get in those participatory workshops, actually the more representative those outcomes are for the model trajectory. So one thing that's very challenging is just to get people in the room. Yeah. And there's budget in the project for it, but it'll be nice, for the, through the Above network and through the IARPC network to make sure that's well advertised.
Yeah, I was going to suggest that I think IARPC could play a role in helping advertise, and we definitely are interested in seeing those activities. So let's make sure that you and I communicate, and
okay,
I can link back with IARPC or whatever.
Awesome. So. That's great.
Any other questions from the audience?
I have a question, and I'm sorry if I missed this or if this is a misinterpretation, because I am not a terrestrial ecologist, but I'm wondering the study area, if there's any tribal land involved, and if that subsistence ecosystem service is also taken into account.
There wasn't a, when we were picking up the study sites, we were constrained a little bit about with some of where we're looking at like a co-joining of inventory data, remotely sensed data, available management plans that were all publicly available. So we had these two sites. So, to some degree, the Prince Albert Forest Management Area does have, and in fact, the manager, Saka Aski, is a partnership, a tribal organization, owned organization that manages forests in that area. The extent to which indigenous subsistence work or the provisioning is done there, I am not as familiar. It seems to me, and I'm going to learn more about this, but the most of what I see out of that is timber processing. That's not to say that the framework, I actually really like to apply this framework and think about an area that is heavily utilized in a subsistence framework, because one of the goals of putting these different study sites around was to highlight how different types of management compare and contrast in a similar system, right, geographically separated, but maybe different methods for how management actions get done. They can vary drastically from site to site. It would be really, Tanana is a state forest. It's not federal. It would be really interesting to see a tribal area or a place that's managed for subsistence be included, so we could see kind of what decisions are made about future management trajectories. The modeling is the same, essentially. Knowing where those places are, knowing how to initialize and spin the model up, and then having the appropriate ability to interact with those groups appropriately would be really cool. And maybe that's something that IARPC could help to think about, or help me think about, knowing a little bit less about those types of managed systems. But I'd love to think about one of those case studies. That would be fantastically interesting.
Yeah, I think Jeremy Littell and Steve Gray might have some more information on that, and they're co-leads with Mike on this team, but they're here in Alaska, and I know Jeremy does a lot of work with communities, so
cool.
Work on that.
It doesn't have to be a huge state forest that's 1 million acres either, right? Even smaller areas are interesting in terms of management actions and their consequences.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
It's Crystal again. David, I just got back from the Jedi Science Team meeting, and that doesn't help because it doesn't go very far north for real Boreal, but it helps for some of your more southern work, or it's going to help. And of course, there is ISAT as well.
Yeah, I was. Do you know if some of the early that's planned, right?
The first Jedi data, they're hoping to have it out towards the end of September or 1st of October for us to start playing with. Yeah,
do you know it has a funky path, right?
Yeah, it's on the space station, so it only goes up to 54 north, which is the irritating part.
No, but that plus ISAT, we had thought about adding in some ISAT data for the stand initialization. Hadn't thought about Jedi. It's a good suggestion. I think we were a little uncertain because this, the work was proposed about a year ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
Never
always
really
better after.
Didn't want to link it
to launched.
Yeah, didn't want to link it to something that seemed like
might not make it. That's right. But it's exciting that they're both up and operating well. So
yeah, that's great. So any insights on that use and also thinking about the albedo product too. So we how that can play into the modeling would be helpful, because the management decisions are going to be patchwork up there, and incorporating the smaller products or more resolved products are just going to be really helpful. I'd even really like to see just what those two products mean in terms of what kind of values we get with the coarser and the finer. Could lead to drastically different values. It should be really interesting.
Yeah, and Amy Neuschwander and Laura Duncanson are they're on above to do some comparisons too. Jedi
cool.
Team and ISAT team. So we've got the best on it.
Cool. Okay, that's great.
Yep.
Anybody else? Otherwise, I'll turn it over to Meredith if she wants to close this out.
Sure. Thanks, Mike. I think the only things that I have left to say are that there is a permafrost collaboration team meeting on Monday at 11 Alaska time, 3 Eastern, and the title is Tundra Be Damned, and it's about beaver manipulation, I guess, of the or changing the ecosystems in the tundra and how that looks. And so that might be of interest to some people on this call, and you're welcome to join if that's the case. And I'm not sure that we have a concrete plan for the next terrestrial ecosystems meeting, but we will let everyone know as soon as we do. And I'll follow up with Mike and Dave on some of the follow-up actions from this meeting, and we can close it out if there's nothing left to say.
I'm good. Thanks a lot, Dave, and Meredith. Thank you for coordinating everything. And that's it for me.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Bye. Have a good weekend.